the background issues that we need to I will present rather than argue for, because there is a lot to do with points 3 and 4, which are the center of my argument. So let's go and see how it goes. The first part then is about how to define action. And the idea I will develop is that compensatory mechanisms are the crucial feature of active thinking rather than intentional features. So in order to explore the possible role of feelings in regulating our thinking, we need to demonstrate that there is something like a cognitive agency in thinking. Everyone knows Strawson's famous piece about mental ballistics, where he claims that thinking is something that occurs in us, but that we can hardly direct because contents of thought, beliefs one has, the judgments one forms, the states of understanding one entertains are uncontrollable. There was an important critical discussion of this paper, including Bucharest 2005, Mealy 2009, Soteriou in his book 2013. But all this debate, to summarize it, is about the metaphysics of action. What is essential for an action to take place? And I will defend, although I not argue for lack of time, that the view of action that is particularly useful to discuss thinking is Harry Frankfurt's. What is constitutive of action for him is not its antecedents, that is the intentions, to act, but the existence of compensatory mechanisms in a goal-oriented trajectory. This is defended in Harry Frankfurt's 1975, The Problem of Action. He writes, for example, behavior is purposive when its course is subject to adjustments which compensate for the effects of forces which would otherwise interfere with the course of behavior. So applied to thinking, which of course is not his purpose in this particular paper, thinking is purposive, that is qualifies as a cognitive action when the train of thought is subject to that compensate for the effects of forces which would otherwise interfere with it. Which purpose? Well, purpose doesn't need to be pre-specified. It can be categorization, learning, retrieving, reasoning, in brief, any controlled use of one's own informational processes. Which forces? Well, for example, irrelevant associations, intrusions of alternative worries, error, failure in encoding, retrieval, etc. Examples of cognitive actions are trying to recover forgotten information, trying to acquire knowledge, that is trying to learn, trying to perceptually discriminate and categorize items. And another type of cognitive action, which I discuss in different papers, is strategic actions like deliberating about whether P and planning pragmatic actions. To come back to Frankfurt's idea of action, and based on Frankfurt's own definition, we can say that our sense of our own agency, when we cognitively act, is nothing more than the way it feels to us when we are somehow in touch with the operation of mechanisms of this kind by which our thinking processes are guided and their course guaranteed. Acting cognitively on this view does not require permanently controlling our train of thoughts, but being prepared to repair it if necessary, that is when a discrepancy is detected. So this takes care, I think, of the major thrust of Strawson's argument. So this definition, Harry Frankfurt's definition, moves the debate about cognitive agency from what one intends to achieve, that is the viewpoint of antecedents, to what it's like to experience oneself as agentive, that is the viewpoint, I will argue, the viewpoint of sensitivity to feedback, that is to agentive feelings. Point 2 is the question of whether the compensatory activity is similar across action types. And here I will present arguments first in favor of a positive response. Initial evidence of this kind of answer, that is, it's the same type of feelings that occur both in motor and in cognitive control, comes from the notion of an internal model. That is the notion that is developed in feedforward ideas of motor control from Jeannereau 2001 to Volpert, Gahamani, and Jordan 1995, and also extended more recently to feedforward models of cognitive control by Metcalfe and Green. The generalizing requires activating an internal model of the action. This model is used by the control system to send commands and to evaluate completion of each subsequence of an action. Such evaluation, the evaluation of completion, is performed sequentially through a series of comparators. Here is a little schema of what a comparator is like. So, of course, it's reduced through the comparator itself. It needs an internal model beforehand to predict the feedback and compare it with the observed feedback. And you have this comparator, which is indicated here by the cross. And the output of the comparator is a feeling with a given valence, positive or negative, and an intensity that is also high or low. So what is interesting is that the comparator gives us all that is necessary to understand for the compensatory function of feelings. The input of a comparator includes observed and expected signal. The output includes either non-conscious error, detect and repair signals, and or conscious feelings of discrepancy, which are more interesting to us because they give us the what is likeness of cognitive agency. Feelings have the general function, in the view that I am presenting now, of detecting significant discrepancies in the trajectories to goals and revising behavior or agentive control accordingly. So how do you make the case for the non-specificity of feelings? Well, you just say there is one source of feelings, which is the discrepancy from expected states. And therefore, the feelings involved in action guidance are basically similar across all kinds of action. All these feelings of discrepancy lead agents to adjust behavior or thought, that is the output function, to approximate a stored reference value. You find this in Surfing Uncertainty by Andy Clark, 2016. He writes, the character of our emotional experience depends both on the interoception of brute bodily signals, as claimed by William James, and higher level cognitive appraisals. A single highly flexible process fluidly combines top-down predictions with all manner of bottom-up sensory information. So the conclusion for him is that subjective feeling states are determined by the ongoing unfolding of this single process. So clearly he believes there is one form of feelings across forms of agency. This notion of a single process is by no means a recent one. In a traditional view, feelings track divergent process or outcome predictions, positive when expectancies are met, for example, enthusiasm, hope, excitement, joy, elation, or negative when expectancies are unfavorable, anxiety, dysphoria, despair. There is a more recent and very attractive view of the single process idea defended by Charles Carver and Michael Scheier from 1990, but there were many more articles that they wrote on the subject. Their alternative model of the role of emotion in action feedback is based on control theory. For them, action implies successive changes between states. Any point in an action sequence then can be assessed for its distance to the goal. What is monitored is the resulting vector, how rapidly the successive states move to or away from the expected goal. And they call this meta-monitoring. Meta-monitoring of one's action tracks the rate of discrepancy reduction in the behavioral monitoring system over time. So there are then 3 varieties of feedback, of which only 2 are effective. The kind of feedback of the monitoring style, that is that which deals with low-level comparators, it only deals with distance to goal and there is no effect produced. But meta-monitoring loops deal with discrepancies in 2 ways. So there are 2 meta-monitoring loops. One extracts velocity, that is the first derivative of distance over time, and the other extracts acceleration properties of the current activity, which is a second derivative of distance over time. Of course, distance here is metaphorical, but it has a very significant functional meaning too. So what is felt? In the case of velocity, you feel elation or sadness. And in the case of acceleration, you feel something more, exhilaration versus sinking feelings. And what is very interesting in their view is that time spans taken into consideration are allowed to vary and they modify the affective experience. So if you take in consideration the whole 10 past years you've been working on a demonstration, for example, you will have a different view about your velocity and acceleration than if you take just the last hour. So in summary, a dynamic view of action control tends to consider that agentive feelings are basically similar across overt, that is bodily, and covert, that is cognitive, sorry, it's not agentive, types of action. This view, however, has unhappy architectural consequences concerning the relations between informational states and reward assessment. I have been working a lot on these consequences for the past few years, and now I come with a more precise defense of why the unicity claim cannot work. So I will make the claim for the specificity claim of metacognitive feelings based on 3 reasons. First, embeddedness. Well, embeddedness suggests an inverse engineering hypothesis. An epistemic action, as everyone knows, is often embedded in an overt pragmatic action, but also vice versa. For example, in example 1, you try to mentally reconstruct a forgotten shopping list when you are at shopping site. And then you are in this situation. In blue, you have the instrumental action, that is the shopping from home to end of shopping. And in the middle, you realize that you have forgotten the list and you reconstruct it. So here, your action of reconstructing the list is embedded in the larger instrumental action. Note that here, when you reconstruct the list, it's a different norm that is being used. You need to build a correct list, whereas the larger instrumental action has a norm of utility. For example, spending that and that money or spending that and that time in the shop. In example 2, you try to reconstruct a forgotten shopping list by writing down a new list. Here you have a cognitive action that is recovering the list, and you have the instrumental action that is the writing part, where you need to write and you need to use a pen and you need to not to spend too much time and so on and so forth. So all feelings, agentive or not, then belong to some kind of section of an action, either instrumental or cognitive. But given that they are all embodied, I think we need to agree with this. There is a high evidence for that. They all have a sensory vehicle, but it would be highly confusing for an action system to have a single type of discrepancy signal in an action sequence for both cognitive and bodily actions, given that, as we saw, both actions overlap in time. So we need to have a way of disentangling 2 potential sources of discrepancy. It requires having sensory feeling whose function is to track errors in the overt action. This is too heavy for me, for example. and sensory feelings whose function is to track errors in the covert cognitive action. I'm very uncertain that my reconstruct list is exhaustive. So subjective experiences from the reverse engineering viewpoint must tell whether a feeling is noetic, that is, it has to do with what I do with my informational states, or pragmatic, what I do with my rationality constraints, even though both kinds are embodied in their vehicles. So that was my first argument. The second argument is the notion of having distinct norms. A cognitive action imposes standards of correction of the normative requirement kind. For example, my reconstructed list must be either exhaustively correct, false alarms okay, or it must be accurate, no false alarms accepted, but on the other hand, not necessarily exhaustive. So these kind of norms have to be determined for not only for an action to be correct, but for an action to exist at all. Whereas in a pragmatic action, you typically have pro tanto standards of utility, as Bloom calls them. For example, I can write with a pen, a computer, my right hand, my left hand, have somebody write for me, etc. There is no requirement for the way the action needs to be executed. So the proper decision about the epistemic norm relevant to a cognitive action depends on informational predictions, and not only on reward or utility, which admits substitutes pro tanto, as we said. I say not only because there is no denial that when you reconstruct your shopping list, you need it for your shopping to occur. So you have also utility for this cognitive action. But still, the cognitive part is determined by requirements that cannot be moved around, as it's the case for reward or utility. So although the two kinds of feelings need to be fused for decision making, they also need to be stored separately for calibration purposes. So if this is true, then the distinction should be mapped within feelings of confidence. A variety of feelings should be dedicated to informational precision and availability according to the norms of normative requirements. And another variety should be dedicated to general rationality demands. And it turns out that this distinction that I am simply anticipating for now has been documented among confidence feelings. And this is work by Coriat, Mayen, and Nussinson 2006, where they distinguish between goal-driven and data-driven feelings of confidence. This is one of the most difficult papers of Coriat and his team, but it's well worth reading. Let's start with goal-driven feelings of confidence. They are the feelings that everyone knows about. It's feedback from performance, or also called process monitoring. A feeling is goal-driven when it follows performance and monitors it. Subjective experience then informs control regulation. For example, after having spent some time reading a story, the agent feels that she doesn't understand it and decides to read it again. So that's clearly goal-driven because the performance occurs and there is a lack of understanding at the end, which which determines the agent to redo the action. On the second part of the feelings of confidence are much less evident. They are data-driven, that is, they are generated by the feedback from the initiation of a cognitive task. For example, you glance at the statement of a mathematical problem, which generates a feeling of ease or difficulty of a certain kind. Or you start searching your memory for a target word, which generates a feeling of knowing. All these are data-driven because they depend upon the impression you get when confronted with the task. A crucial property, however, of data-driven feelings of confidence is their sensitivity to incentives. So this figure here is, this diagram is particularly interesting to comment. It's devoted to judgments of learning. So young adults are invited to do a task, that is to study pairs of words for a certain time. And they are invited to produce judgments of learning at several points of their study time. And what is interesting is that I must also make an important precision, that is, it's a self-paced learning task. That is, the subjects can learn a given pair as long as they wish, depending on the felt difficulty of this particular task. So it's typically something that has to do with data-driven feeling, because they decide how difficult it will be to learn that. And what you see is that there is a general trend in which is to the more time they need to spend on a given pair, the less confident they are to have learned that pair, which is very strange, but it's correct actually. It's the correct way of interpreting the time spent on the task when you choose how long you want to spend on it. But the second thing you must note is that when you earn 1 point for being correct in your learning, or when you earn 3 points for being correct in your learning, that changes your judgment of learning. You are more confident in what you do for 3 points than for 1 point. But the general trend is the same. It's the same parallel drop in both cases. So there is something extremely puzzling here, because when you use the goal-driven feeling of confidence, subjects normally say that the more they learn, the more they will remember. So there is here a conflict between two ways of interpreting the duration of study, and the authors, Coriat and et al., they interpret this difference by the fact that when you are in the data-driven stance, you use a heuristic of time where more time means less learning. Whereas when you are in a goal-driven stance, you use the reverse heuristic, that more times means more learning. And finally, it turns out that subjects fuse the two heuristics in one confidence level that covers both conflicting viewpoints. This evidence, to me, supports the view that action feelings are not similar in function from, in the case of cognitive actions and in the case of utility actions. So the view I propose is that goal-driven performance feedback is the function of informational noetic feelings. Arguments of embeddedness and norm specificity hold for this category of feelings. They monitor informational quality and availability. For example, feelings of understanding, feelings of cognitive relevance, of coherence or incoherence, feelings of interest are all the result of processing online and the feedback from this performance. Their function is guidance and calibration of the comparator. And they are noetic to the extent that they evaluate the epistemic positive or negative affordances involved in learning reasoning. Positive affordance means that they tell the subject that is really collecting information and doing things right, and the negative affordance go, of course, on the other way. Data-driven, on the other hand, that is controlled feedback, elicits executive feelings related to cognitive agency. So that's what is bizarre. We are speaking of cognitive agency, but even in cognitive agency, you find executive feelings, which are not specific to cognitive agency. They typically occur in the simulation sequence that is hypothesized by all theorists of motor cognition to be engaged to regular motor engagement in an activity, and also by many metacognition theorists who say that it's needed to engage in cognitive engagement in an activity. Examples are the feelings of knowing a given name, the feeling of likely ease or difficulty of processing, the feeling of cognitive readiness of a task, the feeling of bodily readiness for jumping, etc., the feeling of fatigue, the feeling of authorship. All of these are, in my view, executive feelings, and they are not specific to metacognition. Their function is to adjust effortfulness to predicted reward and opportunity cost. You may know about the terrific work by Kurtzman on this, which shows that effortfulness has a lot to do with the fact that you neglect other ways of, thinking when you do any kind of cognitive task. And this is part of what is measured by the sense that you should stop or not the activity. So these feelings, the executive feelings, motivate action persistence through specific feelings of confidence, and most importantly, they determine the criterion for when to stop in a given cognitive task and context. And here, if you're interested, the work by Rakefet Ackerman, in particular, her article of 2014 on the stopping rule, is absolutely crucial. So in conclusion, and this will be my last slide, there are common agentive feelings that are generated in the realm of control or of performance. Sorry, in the realm of no, sorry, again, I'm wrong. Common agentive feelings are generated indeed in the realm of control. They are executive feelings, and they assess the trade-off effort, benefit, and likely progress to goal. On the other hand, there are distinctive metacognitive feelings that are generated while performing cognitive actions, and they are related to an evaluation of how the normative requirements are fulfilled in a given informational process. For example, feelings of understanding, feelings of incoherence, feeling of interest or boredom. Thank you for your attention.